going to be in the book of Daniel this morning. I know. You already know that. But if you were visiting, we're going to be in the book of Daniel this morning. And we're going to be in chapter 6. So we're moving right along through this book. I hope you've been enjoying it as I have, learning some things along the way. And today specifically, I think we're going to find some practical applications. I know it seems surprising because we're thinking of lions, but today I think we get to see how is God going to teach us through chapter 6. So this is my hope for us this morning. We get to, of course, the famous chapter 7, if you've been in Sunday school and you drew pictures and you Daniel in the lion's den. This is where we're at today. And it's the end of one part. It's the end of the narrative part of the book of Daniel. That is history. And it's the beginning, after this chapter, of the visions and the dreams of the future. So you can't miss that either. And what I would like to do is go ahead and read actually only a portion of this morning. Because there will be enough in there for 2 Sundays. So if you're with me here in Daniel chapter 6, I will start reading in verse 1. It seemed good to Darius to appoint 120 satraps over the kingdom, that they would be in charge of the whole kingdom, and over them 3 commissioners, of whom Daniel was one, that these satraps might be accountable to them, and that the king might not suffer loss. Then this Daniel began distinguishing himself among the commissioners and satraps, because he possessed an extraordinary spirit, and the king planned to appoint him over the entire kingdom. Then the commissioners and satraps began trying to find a ground of accusation against Daniel in regard to government affairs. But they could find no ground of accusation or evidence of corruption, inasmuch as he was faithful, and no negligence or corruption was to be found in him. Then these men said, "We will not find any ground of accusation against this Daniel, unless we find it against him with regard to the law of his God." Then these commissioners and satraps came by agreement to the king and spoke to him as follows: "King Darius, live forever. All the commissioners of the kingdom, the prefects and the satraps, the high officials and the governors have consulted together that the king should establish a statute and enforce an injunction that anyone who makes a petition to any god or man beside you, O king, for 30 days, shall be cast into the lion's den. Now, O king, establish the injunction and sign the document so that it may not be changed, according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which may not be revoked." Therefore, King Darius signed the document, that is, the injunction. Now, when Daniel knew that the document was signed, he entered his house, the roof chamber. He had windows open towards Jerusalem, and he continued kneeling on his knees 3 times a day, praying and giving thanks before his God, as he had been doing previously. Then these men came by agreement and found Daniel making petition and supplication before his God. Then they approached and spoke before the king about the king's injunction. "Did you not sign an injunction that any man who makes a petition to any god or man beside you, O king, for 30 days is to be cast into the lion's den?" The king replied, "The statement is true, according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which may not be revoked." Then they answered and spoke before the king, "Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, O king, or the injunction which you signed, but keeps making his petition 3 times a day." Then, as the king heard this statement, he was deeply distressed. And we're going to pause here in our reading. Let me ask a word of prayer on this. Father, I ask this morning that you would use this story, this account of Daniel, and that you would find a way to teach each one of us. that you would look into our hearts, look into our minds, and that you would prompt us, like Daniel, to know to whom we belong and to whom we serve, and that, like Daniel, you would give us the courage to stand for what is right. In Jesus' name, amen. In our story here, if you actually back up to verse 31 of chapter 5, it's right there in front of you, you'll recall that just as Belshazzar, in 531, was feasting and mocking God, the Medo-Persian army entered the city of Babylon. Remember that? And ended the mighty Babylonian Empire in one night. Okay. The new ruler is called Darius right here. Darius the Mede, which stresses his nationality, right? And later, this same king, I think, is called Cyrus the Persian. Now, there's going to be some discussion about this, and a lot of ink has been spilled by a lot of scholars about this distinction. A lot of history, a lot of things are going into, well, who is this guy? Who is that guy? Is it possible that they're the same person? And they look at a lot of the dates, and they come up with some ideas. In the commentaries that I have and I have consulted, I think the best reading for us is that Darius, the Persian, and Cyrus the Great are the same person, and that these are actual titles given to them. We do this in other cultures and languages and places. Kings are given titles over various jurisdictions. This will be kind of the same idea. But this will help us, at least I think, to make sense of the different names. So keep that in mind. So for my purposes, I will assume that these are not separate people, but the same person. And at this point in our story, chapter 6, I want you to recall that 100 years before the event of the fall of Babylon, 100 years before, God prophesied it by naming Babylon and the conqueror. 100 years before it happened. Can anybody do that today? Can you even calculate the forecast for tomorrow? No, of course not. Over 100 years before it happens. Now, I'm going to give you the verse, of course, because you need to see this. It is in Isaiah chapter 13, verse 17. Isaiah was before this took place. Isaiah was actually during the time that the Assyrians came and took the northern kingdom. He saw it. He was there, prophesied. And then he starts talking about, look, it's going to happen. The south's going to happen. But God had prophesied in Isaiah 13:17, behold, this is God, I am going to stir up the Medes against them, who will not value silver or take pleasure in gold. The Medes. It's outlined. God knows the future. But that's not it. There's another one. We'll say about 25 years now before Babylon invades Jerusalem, we have another prophet called Jeremiah. Again, before the events happen, God uses Jeremiah in chapter 51, verse 11, and he says, sharpen the arrows, fill the quivers. The Lord has stirred up the spirit of the kings of the Medes, because his plan is against Babylon to destroy it. For it is the vengeance of the Lord, vengeance for his temple. Why for the temple? What happened? They destroyed the temple. Yes. Judgment was brought upon the sin of Israel. God brought the judgment in the form of the Babylonians, but the Babylonians were not good people, and they did not worship God, and God also had a plan for their punishment, and it's written in your Bible. Before it happened. You need to see this. Skeptics will look at the Bible and they'll say, look, it's just a book. There's no book that can do this. There's no book that has done this. So this is not just a book. This is the Word of God. So we come back to our chapter 6 here in Daniel. And I'm only going to go to 14 because I want you to see a few things important here before we get, to the lions, of course. So in verses 1 and 2, Daniel is here, and he has yet another ruler to contend with, right? We've been going through the book. Daniel is in his 80s now. He's like some people here. How dare I? And in his time, he has served some big people. Nebuchadnezzar. Oh, man. The head of gold, right? Nebuchadnezzar. The next person would have been Nabonidus. We talked about him just a little bit last week. And then his son, Belshazzar, who ended in chapter 531. Now he has a new person to work with, Darius. A lot of people for him. And the empire is vast. It was big under the Babylonians. It's big under the Persians and the Medes. So they have 120, we'll say, local governors that they put in place. It's a big empire. Remember, no cell phones. They have to have people on site. What's interesting to me is then they put 3 more, we'll call them super rulers, super governors, over all of them. Do you see why in the text? Why? So that the king wouldn't lose any money. Oh, that sounds like government. In verse 3, Daniel began distinguishing himself among the 3 super governors. Daniel's reputation, I assume, would have even caused the new regime, Darius, to take note of his abilities. Everybody else there would have known, look, this guy's been here. He keeps getting promoted. He's a really, really good governor, good person to have in place. And in Daniel, verse 3 there, Darius wants to make him the head of the 3. Right? 123, and then Daniel will be the top person. He does that because he's recognized his reputation. He's recognized his skills. But he has an honorable reputation. That's what distinguishes him. At this point, again, he's in his 80s. I find it interesting. He hasn't retired from public life. I know. I'm going to pick on the retirees here. He's not out golfing. Daniel and Shadrach and Meshach, they're not out golfing, enjoying life. Daniel is not getting soft on his convictions either. He's not. And I hope this morning, when we look at the walk of Daniel with God here, even into his later years, my hope is this morning we find an encouragement that we also aren't too old and too set in life to lose track of our convictions. Amen. We don't want to. The world isn't losing track of theirs, and they aren't changing their view and their hostility towards God. We can't either. So let's look to Daniel for this today. At this point in history, if you know your biblical history, the first of the Jewish exiles are doing what? They are returning to Jerusalem. At this point in the story, under Zerubbabel, the first of them, because Cyrus signs the decree later on. This is what's happening right now. Daniel is getting put in place again. All right, you're the guy again. Some of the Jews are now returning. History is unfolding before your eyes, just like God said it would. I think what strikes me in this passage is we have Daniel's character just on the line. It is on the line for everyone to see. It has been before. But what you notice with Daniel is he doesn't change from when he was 15 or 12 or until his 80s. And when we look around at Christians, especially if we're younger, these are the people we're looking for. We are. A young Christian, and I don't mean by age, but a young Christian is looking for seasoned Christians who have lived the life, to whom they can gain wisdom, they can gain encouragement from. And if that's you, Don't sit back. Don't sit back and let others, because others don't have the experience that you have from walking with God. So don't think, well, look, I have gray hair now, and I've done my time. You're like Daniel. You haven't done your time, because we need you. The new generations need your character that you've developed with God. So this is your encouragement today, okay? Daniel lived in a secular or pagan culture since he was a teenager. So again, if you're thinking Seattle, if you're thinking Vegas, wherever you happen to go and live, Daniel lived it. He lived in the culture and he worked in the secular environment. But still, Daniel remains upright and blameless. What a challenge. What a real challenge this is. Daniel lives his faith out and used the gifts and skills that God gave him. He worked in the culture. He didn't hide. He didn't, maybe he would have liked to work in a monastery and just worship God all day. No, God gave him abilities, he used them. God gives you abilities. We need to use them. This morning, I'm going to hope that we take a moment, each one of us, to evaluate our lives. Each one individually. I don't know your lives. As if they would be searched through by enemies. What would they see? Because that's what's going to happen to Daniel, right? This is what they're going to look for. And I'm going to go back to this here. In verse 4, then the commissioners and the satraps began trying to find ground for accusation against Daniel. Wow. Direct hostility here. Direct opposition. Jealousies in the court. Jealousies in the workplace. So the 120, maybe not all of them, but the idea is, because I say that because they're spread out across a pretty large kingdom. And again, without email and text message, it would have taken quite a while. But a lot of them get together to get rid of Daniel. Let's say they went through his emails. Oh, you've been writing. Well, let's say they scrolled through his phone. What's on there? They got to his Facebook page. What's on the Facebook page? Well, I don't have one, but I do have a phone. So you could look through my phone. What about his social media? What is he writing there? What's he saying? Who is he following? That's what they're looking for. They're digging. Back in the 80s, we didn't have all of this. You had to hire a PI, to go looking through your trash. They snooped around his workplace, talked to his coworkers. What's this Daniel guy like? Is he nice? Do you like him? Does he say bad things? And you know what they found? Nothing. I don't know. Do you know somebody today where you could go through all of that and find nothing? It's incredible. Daniel was a good man in private as he was in public. He was a godly man in private as he was in public. And so that's what I wanted to bring to our attention this morning. And you don't have to do it right now, but maybe this afternoon. Look inside your own life. What will people see? Will they be drawn to you as an upright, honest person, or will they maybe look somewhere else for that? But I think even more importantly, of course, is what will God see? What does God see in our lives? Because that's what really matters here. What does God see? So we move on to verse 5. Then these men said, we won't find anything. They knew, which is amazing to me. They already knew. We won't find anything to accuse him of. Daniel was not perfect, but he was certainly blameless in this regard. He wasn't without faults, but morally upright, and in this case, beyond reproach. And of course, you and I have that same duty to walk morally, to live godly in the church, outside of the church. We have the same call upon our lives. how we live and how we talk, what our work ethic is, this is something people see. We see it in the church, but we certainly see it outside of the church. And the news and the headlines love it if they can find something wrong. They love to put it out there so we can see. Don't forget that the world outside these doors doesn't like Jesus. If they did, they would be in the doors. The world is secular. The world has all kinds of pagan beliefs. They don't like God, the God of the Bible. They don't like what we worship, what we bow to. And they would rather we promote their philosophy, their sins, their lifestyle than the ones that are in the Bible. That's what they would prefer. And so, of course, this morning we have to take stands against things. Of course, murder is wrong. We know that. But murder comes in different ways. Sometimes it looks like abortion, a different name. If we stand against substance abuse, like if they legalize it in places, not that that would happen. Do we stand against substance abuse? Because we know that it destroys the person. And ultimately, the Bible says you shouldn't be controlled by other things than the Spirit of God. So do we stand for these things, or do we promote them along with society? That's something you have to answer. I don't answer for you. I do answer for me, though. The same happens with gender confusion today. Any kind of illicit affairs outside of marriage, all of these things are things that the world is promoting against the Bible. And we have a chance to be like Daniel and say, no, I will stick with what the Bible tells me to do, with what God is telling me to do. So this is what we're finding in our passage this morning. And I think you're going to find if you stand for the Bible, if you stand for truth, religious freedoms we talked about with the 4th of July, if you stand for these things, biblical values, you will find that people really don't like you. Because when you stand for something, that means you, by definition, stand against something else. The two can't go together. So long as... Here's one way the world will like you, though. If you say, look, I like God and I like Jesus and the Bible, but I'm okay with what you do also. Right? Have you heard this? Well, yes. This has been since antiquity. This has been since the very beginning. So long as you worship our stuff with your stuff, so long as you bow to this and to God, well, then there's no problem. This was the problem with the early Christians. I say problem. This is what the Romans didn't like. The Romans, especially the early ones, the emperors, were very much opposed to Christianity. Not because they worshiped God, because they worshiped God only. The Romans, like the Greeks, like every other group, said, fine, just add him to our group. Add another God in here, we're all fine. But God says no. Daniel was given this opportunity. In fact, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Just bow down here for a second. It's no problem. Just when you hear the music playing, and they said, no, we can't. And Daniel, same thing. No, we can't. You can't mix. And it's not me telling you this. I mean, it sounds like it. This is all in your Bible, okay? God has told us there is only one God. You cannot mix false religion with your one God. This is what they're trying to do with Daniel here. So in verse 6, they made a deal to fight together against Daniel. And they knew they could only fight with his God. But I want you to remember that this has happened before. When Jesus was teaching, back in the New Testament, against human religion, we found some group of people joining groups together to fight him. The Pharisees and the Sadducees were groups that didn't like each other. They believed slightly different things. When Jesus came on the scene, they got together to fight Jesus. It says it. Oh, there are some other people that got together. How about Pilate and Herod? They didn't even talk before. Jesus comes on the scene for the trial. they became friends as they accused Jesus. You see, people hate the Bible if they like their sin. They don't want it. Today we find the same thing. I don't have to tell you what's in the news and things, laws that are passed and court decisions. They're coming together as groups because they don't want things that the Bible teaches. And you know this. We see it all around us. We'll get to a few of those in a little bit. Let's go to verses 7 and 8 in our text here. They all come before the king now. They said, look, we did our job, you did your job, and we found that we all agree. We all agree on this law. But of course, this would have to be a lie, because had they asked Daniel? Well, no. And he's in the top 3. They didn't ask him. He didn't agree. So this was the first part. This was a lie. But those who hate God also use lies to paint wrong pictures of Christians. They will if they can. They'll tell half-truths. I find that you will find lots of polls put out that give half the story so that they can promote something. And pressure to keep Christians underfoot is what we find in our country today. There's pressure out there. It comes in all different ways. Laws will get passed to limit speech, to limit teaching or preaching what's in the Bible. I can still remember this as it was 15 years ago maybe, that they were going about saying, look, this kind of preaching, if you're preaching on sin, if you're preaching on adultery, that's hateful. And it was only, I think, 15 so years ago that they were trying to pass laws that they could go after preachers or teachers and get all their sermons and all their notes and say, well, if you're doing this, then we're going to have to punish you. This is America. Maybe you forgot this. In Canada, they do that too. Street preachers are getting harassed and sent to prison. Why? Because they're preaching the truth. They don't want the truth. This is what we live in today. In fact, you know this, public prayer, Christian public prayer was stopped in schools. We know this. Bibles, the 10 Commandments were removed from courts of law. Did you know that? Yes. You remember when that happened? They took the things right out from the court of law, where truth is established. Laws were passed to create safe zones in front of abortion clinics. I don't know if you know that. Because Christians would stand outside and pray. So they passed laws that said, well, you got to be at least this far away. You can't be, we don't want you to bother the people coming in. This is how they start to limit God's influence in the world, our influence in the world. The schools pass laws where they get to promote agendas that are non-Christian, whether it's evolution, whether it's secular lifestyles, and of course all kinds of strange genders. That's what's being passed and promoted. What you don't find promoted is traditional marriage. You don't find promoted abstinence anymore. Do you see how it's happening? Different for Daniel, but we have it here today. When Nebuchadnezzar was in power, he had absolute power. You remember that? We went through that. If he said you die, you die. If he said you live, you live. He made the law. He was the law. Under the Medes and the Persians, they have a different system. More like a democratic system, but really based upon laws. If they wrote it into law, even the king was under the law. And these satraps knew that. So they said, let's make a law. And it's interesting, in verse 9 here, they do that. Therefore, King Darius signed the document, that is the injunction. Darius signed a new law into effect, one that apparently even he couldn't change or get around. And I think we now face similar challenges, and I'm going to call it a quasi-democratic system we live in. If enough votes are gathered, people are elected, laws are passed. This is how it works where we live. And sometimes it can take 50 years to change things like that. or longer. Or maybe they don't change. Maybe it's permanent. For Daniel, going against this particular law meant death. That's what it meant. I don't know if you have anything like that in your life right now. Daniel faced it. This is the law, or this is death. He could worship and believe what they said, or he could worship and believe God. He had two choices. So here's a thought. When Bibles are smuggled into a communist or a Muslim country, and the Christians are caught, they are thrown into prison or they are killed. Today. Not in Daniel's day. Today. And yet there are laws in those countries that forbid them from doing that. And you might say, well, maybe they shouldn't do that. But then how will the word be preached to the ends of the earth? How will that happen? Except that Christians follow God's law. When churches here in America, some of them refuse to close their doors and continue worshiping during Corona, a few face legal battles and fines. But as far as I know, none of us in this country were thrown to the lions. I don't think so. Still not the same as Daniel. Still not. It says that he's up praying. If you look in your text here, this is where they found him, praying. And the word petition there, Daniel is petitioning. Daniel is praying to God for help, for guidance. That's what we do when we pray, don't we? We make a petition. We ask. But imagine that that was outlawed. Can you imagine that for a minute? That your ability to pray to God is outlawed. What would you do? What would you do? Would you keep praying? Be like Daniel? I'm sorry, we passed a law. You can't pray. In fact, you can only pray to this human ruler. If that doesn't sound like some crazy movie from the future, except that was a movie from the past. Technically, if you look in your text, this mandate was only for 30 days. That's what it says. It's just 30 days. Well, maybe that was a good thing temporarily because it would promote unity in the kingdom. We would all have one, Darius is our guy. So for 30 days, we're going to act like everything's fine and Darius is going to be our guy. What would it hurt to not read your Bible for a month? That's going to hurt anything, right? Just don't worry about it. Just, watch this guy on TV. He's the guy we're going to watch for a month. Nothing else. Don't worry. Just a month. It's not such a big deal, right, that the church closes its doors or bans online sermons. Maybe you can't buy any Bibles or Bible studies, but it's just for a month. Do you see now, Daniel? Do you see the story? It's just for a month. Oh, it's subtle. Just for a month. But for Daniel, as I mentioned, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, and so many, many Christian martyrs over the years, denying God is a step they wouldn't take. They simply wouldn't do it. Being told to stop spreading the Bible, spreading the gospel, is something people have said throughout history they will not stop doing. And you may say, well, is there any reason that they should do that? The fact that they don't stop? Yes, I think there is. I think if you go to the book of Acts, you will find Peter and John and the apostles saying, look, you have a law here, but we have God saying no. And we will serve God. I will get you that in a second. So, I wonder if in our year now, in 2022, if we would have that boldness. If we would have Daniel's character and we have the boldness to say, no, I can't stop believing God. I can't stop worshiping God. I can't stop reading my Bible. And by the way, I can't stop telling other people because this is where the life is. Because when our physical life ends, and it will, there's a whole lot more after that. And we can't stop. Not for 30 days. We just can't stop. So in verse 10, now when Daniel knew that the document was signed, Daniel knew. He heard. He wasn't oblivious. He didn't just go about his day as though nothing had happened. Daniel knew. He knew the document. He knew the punishment. It was clear to him what was happening. Daniel knew. He didn't hide. He didn't change his routines. I don't know. Some of us, maybe me, I would have been like, I'm going to keep reading my Bible, keep praying, but maybe I'll go in the basement. I don't know. Daniel said, no. I'm going to keep doing what I did. He trusted God. He said, no. I know what they said, but I know what God says. He stayed with it, and I love that. It's amazing to me. And it mentions that Daniel had already made a habit to pray 3 times a day. He had a habit. He had a routine. He spent time with God. And the flat top of Daniel's roof, which again, if you've been in the Middle East, are flat, and they have a little parapet around so you can't fall off, and often some little shade structure up there. So he goes up there. He's alone. He's with God. He gets a little bit of breeze. And he talked to God daily. Daniel heard about the mandate. The fact that he heard about the mandate, but foreshadows, and here's what we're getting, what the apostles did in Acts 5:29. So there's your verse, Acts 5:29, when they state, we must obey God rather than man. Daniel chose, the apostles chose. And you may say, okay, what else do you have? Well, World War II. We have a famous Christian woman who we revere for her faith because she hid hundreds of people, potentially saved the lives of hundreds of people by hiding Jews in her house. Corrie ten Boom. Do you know she defied Nazi law? Yes, she did, and she knew. But she also knew what the Bible says. She knows life is valuable, and it's better to serve God. So Corrie ten Boom, another example for us. So moving on, we get to verse 11. The men came by agreement and found Daniel making petitions. It's interesting. This group of satraps, their secret meetings, they got together and they planned the date and planned the time, and they show up like these little spies, like these sneaking around. They're like, he's going to be there. Okay, everybody, get your cell phone cameras out. There he is. Except they didn't have that. But they saw him, sure enough. And why wouldn't they? They already knew he prayed 3 times a day. Again, I'm thinking of my own life. Would my neighbors know, at this time, the Webers do this, and at this time, they do that? I wonder if our neighbors would know. So they have their proof, and they rung to King Darius. In verse 12, they use their typical flattery. Oh, king, live forever. And didn't you say this? And didn't we sign this? And of course we did. And thank you for signing that and doing that. And in verse 13, the trap is sprung. Aha, but, in verse 13, and they said, but Daniel. There it is. What about Daniel? And notice what they say about Daniel. You know, that exile from Judah. Why do they say that? That exile from Judah. They don't say the guy who's been here for 70 years, working in the government, helping all the kings. No, that exile. Oh, he's not one of us. He's not born and raised here. He's not like us. But Daniel. A temporary ban on worshiping God, and Daniel is caught worshiping God. Now, of course, they expand the lies. They make the case a little bit stronger. They say, well, look, Daniel doesn't pay any attention to you or your laws, which, of course, would not be true. In fact, Daniel paid such great attention to the laws and to the business that he was elevated to the top. The king liked him. So this was a lie. But again, I like the fact he's 80 years old. They mentioned that Daniel's aged. He's in exile. But he's been faithful this whole time, a faithful servant. And in verse 14, I want you to see that the king was deeply distressed. In the Hebrew and the Aramaic, if you want to read it online, of course, you can do that. It says he was displeased with himself. Darius knew he had been played, and he was very displeased with this. He was stuck. Darius liked Daniel. He valued him. Well, the story gets pretty dramatic moving forward. But you're going to have to come back next week, as Paul Harvey would have said, for the rest of the story, I'm afraid. But before we close, I did want to think about a few things this morning. Are we supposed to pray 3 times a day like Daniel? I mean, it says it in the story. Well, let me ask you, is the sentence descriptive or prescriptive? In other words, is it describing an activity or is it prescribing an activity? When you read your Bible, pay attention. It is describing Daniel's habit, which is probably a good habit for all of us, but it is not prescribing the habit. That's something you and the Holy Spirit have to work out, and we do need to work it out. So we can't use that passage. In fact, let me give you a different passage. 1 Thessalonians 5 instructs us to pray without ceasing. Oh, maybe you want to go back to Daniel now. No, you get to pray without ceasing. It says, giving thanks in every circumstance. That's what we're to do. Ephesians 6:18 also says, pray in the Spirit at all times, and with every kind of prayer and petition. This is us. You find a way to talk to the Holy Spirit. You find your times, but do it more often than not. This is how we develop a godly character that people will see. So we're going to end with something that you already know. We live in dark times. We do. And I don't mean the weather. I mean we live in dark times. In a dark place, ours is a world that isn't running after God, isn't running after Jesus. In fact, much of the world stands in great opposition to God. And so as you reflect on this later today, maybe, I'd like to encourage you to find if there's a way that you and I can align ourselves more with God than with the world. Something you have to do on your own. Look over your habits. Look over your lifestyles. And I would say, like Daniel, see if there's a new habit we can create. The kind of habit where we spend time with God. Only you can do this. I can't do this for you. And then we can be found godly and upright, like Daniel. People can see us and see God in us. I would say, let's ask God to draw away our attachment to the world and, in fact, anchor us to Him. That's what I would say for us this morning. Amen. And we don't have the piano player this morning, but I would love to have him back if he would come up again so we can have communion with a little bit of music. And Arnie, this is a personal note from a pianist to another. I actually really like how you play because I can't play like that. You remind me of bygone days when I would hear churches, and I can't do that. I think it's really neat, and I like the variety. So let's encourage them to keep coming and maybe to keep playing for us if you feel you can. I would encourage that. Now, this morning, we are going to take communion, and I wanted us to have a moment where we just kind of pondered a little bit. the passage this morning. Where we would ponder in our own hearts and just take a moment now. If Arnie wants to play something quietly, that's great. If not, we're just going to sit a moment in silence and look inside our own hearts. Don't look at anybody else's heart. What's in my heart right now? What is there that's like Daniel or not like Daniel? How can I change my habits? How can I spend my time with God, talking to God? How can I influence the world around me by my conduct? What are the things that God needs to change in me? And I would ask that you would allow the Holy Spirit today to show you things, to talk to you as only He can. That God would encourage us to take a good look and to say, there are things I'd like to change. There are things I'd like to do differently. And that you would ask God to draw you close. And then this morning we will take our communion together. If I could have the men come up and get the elements. When you do receive the elements, if you would hold them both at the same time until we all have them. Thank you, Arnie. This morning we continue the tradition that was given to us by Jesus himself. And the point was not to make this a heavy morning, but to realize whom we serve and to realize that this is our source. This is to whom we belong. And this morning we get to remember this until he comes again, that we are his and we are saved and we have a hope that the world needs. So as it says in Corinthians, on the night that Jesus was betrayed, he took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, "This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me." And in the same way, after supper, he took a cup, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you drink of it in remembrance of me. And for as often as you eat this bread and drink the cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes again. Together. Father, I thank you for this time we've had this morning. And by your Spirit, I ask that you would empower us, embolden us to live a life that is godly to you. And I thank you for this time we could have communion together, that we get to share in your sacrifice and the hope that we have in you. In Jesus' name, amen.
The last song is a prayer that we should all walk away with this morning. Lord, lay some soul upon my heart. Lord, lay some soul upon my heart, and love that soul through me, and may I always do my part to win that soul for thee.
Well, today I want to leave you with the verse from Romans as we leave here today. Therefore, having been justified by faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ, through whom we also have obtained our introduction by faith into this grace in which we stand, and we exult in the hope of the glory of God. Amen. And Arnie, thank you for playing. I'm smiling most of the time up here because of your playing.